Okay? Often the decisions of translation in these two ways is dependent upon a larger framework of theology than just the grammar of this verse. Because grammatically, you can translate it either way. And it's a rare word, so it doesn't have a lot of other usages. But from the larger theological perspective, some will kind of go one way or the other. Those who would say that you can affect the time of Christ's coming, what kinds of things would they probably offer that you can do to affect the timing of the coming of Christ?
They should tell people about him that don't know.
Okay, evangelism, that by increased evangelism, in fact, some of them would actually appeal to other passages that say the gospel will be preached to the whole world and then the end will come, things like that, and say by our evangelistic work we can hurry along, if you will, the second coming of Christ. Others are much less impressed with that idea that you can do that and would simply leave it in the more passive way. So the issue can't be resolved by Greek grammar alone, and at least in my thinking, it seems difficult to accept that this time which Jesus said the Father has set by his own authority. That sounds like an appointment that's already made that's not movable. Okay? So I tend to prefer the wait eagerly translation because it seems to me to be theologically better in a larger sense. But I concede that either of these are possible grammatically. Your New Living Translation has gone with this particular translation as well as some others. So you should at least be aware of this translation issue in this passage. When you come to a translation passage that is quite different in this way, my suggestion is you don't hang a lot of weight on that one way or another, because there's too much ambiguity. If you hang a lot of weight on an ambiguous issue, you've got a fairly weak foundation. So I mean, you may go with this translation, but don't build a really heavy theology on it, because I think it's dangerous to do that. Yes?
And another question, I don't know where, but said when the end of the earth, where God's word is preached to the end of the world, then he will be coming. So it's not, is it possible it's not really God set on the absolute day, but it's more conditional when all people at least have a chance to hear the gospel, then he will. So it's not our concept of absolute day.
Those who translate it this way would say that.
Oh.
However, I would say that the word world there means the Roman world, not the globe. Because it's not the typical word for world, but it's the word for world that is usually used of the Mediterranean basin. And I think that happened in the time of the early church in the first century. So I would not necessarily put a lot of weight on that idea. I'm dubious about the idea that in the 21st century, because of aggressive evangelism efforts, we can make Jesus come back sooner than he was intending to. I find that somewhat difficult theologically. That's my opinion, and you don't have to believe it. Okay? Or not you, but I mean anybody doesn't have to believe it. And like I said earlier, God's not going to read my notes before he comes. He doesn't need my help. All right, let's take a 5-minute break, and we're going to come back and talk about the Gospel of John. And don't put in your paragraph you got paid Starbucks for doing this, because that doesn't sound good. Is it protocol? Can I take this off? Or do I need to leave it on?
My wife made it, she's already left, so you can take it.
Well, it's very beautiful, but I find I keep banging into it and catching my thumb in it and so on. All right, are you ready for the fourth gospel?
Yes.
All right. We're going to spend some time today introducing the fourth gospel, and probably a little bit of time tomorrow too, because the fourth gospel has a lot of interesting features that are a little different than you've read in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Beginning with the concept of testimony. Now, you've been reading the Gospel of John, right? Oh, you're doing that today? Well, watch out for the word testimony as you're reading it, because you're going to run into it a number of times throughout the Gospel. And I think the very first thing I want to talk about is the important feature that this testimony is composed within the living memory of the events that they talk about, within 30 to 60 years of the time of Jesus. That is true for this gospel. It is also true of the other gospels, and it is a very important idea. The eyewitness people who knew Jesus personally and who began to write down the things about Jesus, their memories are at the disposal of people who wanted to know more about Jesus. And it's important that those things were written down while this living body of people were still there who knew Jesus personally. There's a great deal of difference between telling a story where a lot of other people were there and telling it 100 years later when nobody was there. Because when there's a lot of people who were there, if you don't say exactly what happened, someone's going to say, hey, wait, hold on, I was there. It didn't go quite like that. We need to give you a little bit of perspective here. 100 years later, that can't happen. So these living witnesses, among whom were, of course, the apostles themselves, are guarantors for the accuracy of the traditions about Jesus, both before and after their formation in what we call the Gospels. So all of the Gospels are written within the living memory of the people who knew Jesus personally. This is something that is not true of the Gnostic literature that came later, some of whom are also called Gospels, like the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, those kind of Gnostic literature. None of those were written during the time there was a living body of witnesses that knew Jesus. But all four of the canonical Gospels are. Now, the testimony of the fourth gospel fits into that because, as you see from the very beginning, he claims to have been an eyewitness of Jesus. He's going to close his gospel with this statement that he is personally an eyewitness of these events. And he functions in the gospel as an unnamed disciple, simply called the disciple Jesus loved, or sometimes called the beloved disciple. It's rather interesting that there are a number of references in the gospel to the person who composed it, but in none of them is his name. There is just this description, the disciple Jesus loved, or the beloved disciple. So, here are the appearances of the disciple in the Gospel of John. There is an unnamed companion of Andrew that is right in the very beginning, the first chapter. It goes back from the time of the baptism of John. This was pretty typical of ancient historians to refer to themselves early in the work without naming themselves. Then at the Last Supper, this disciple is seated immediately next to Jesus. He's the one who leans back toward Jesus and says, after Jesus says, "One of you will betray me," and he leans back and he says, "Who is it?" Okay? Then he appears at the trial of Jesus. He is admitted into He's admitted into the court of the high priest because he knows the high priest and personally. And he not only gets in, but he manages to get Peter in to a closed area. Then he appears at the cross. He's the disciple that Jesus commits the care of his mother to, the same beloved disciple. He is at the empty tomb. He runs there with Peter. We don't know his name, but he runs there with Peter after the women come and explain to them that they have seen an empty tomb. Peter and this beloved disciple run for the tomb. The beloved disciple outruns Peter, gets there first, and in fact is the first person to come to Easter faith. Because when he looked in and saw the empty tomb, it says he believed. Peter may not have understood what was happening just yet, and the women who discovered the empty tomb may not have understood what was happening just yet, but this beloved disciple is the first one to come to Easter faith. And then he appears in the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus in Galilee, where there are 7 disciples together. 5 of them are named, 2 are unnamed, and he is one of the 2 that is unnamed at the end of the Gospel of John. So, if we only look at the Gospel of John, what we sometimes call the 4th Gospel, we will not know who this disciple is. Church tradition from the late 2nd century has said that this disciple was John, the brother of James, the son of Zebedee. But earlier than that, the references only to John. It does not call him John the Apostle, and it doesn't call him John Bar Zebedee. It just says John, or one of them is John the Elder. Now, we do know that there was someone called John the Elder in the circle of Jesus' disciples, because the earliest Christian witnesses talk about him by name. They talk about both John the Apostle and John the Elder. So this is again one of those cases like Judas, where John is a very common name. Yochanan is a fairly common Hebrew name, and we've got at least these 2 characters, both of whom are called John. In the end, there is still a lot of discussion about which of these individuals is the beloved disciple. The longest standing tradition for most of the history of the church is that it is John Bar Zebedee, the brother of James. But the earliest witness is simply John the Elder. And so there's still fusses about that. I'm going to call him John, because that's safe. Everybody agrees it's John somebody. Okay? But they just don't all agree about which John it is. Now, back to this question about witness. Why is it important that the testimony about Jesus in the Gospels comes from people who were living witnesses of his ministry? If the National Geographic, for instance, comes out with a translation of something called the Gospel of Judas, which it did a few years ago, and says this is the real story of Jesus and Judas, what would you say to that? Alas, is that what we said? Oh, a laugh? Well, it is an early document. It was discovered in the Nag Hammadi texts in Egypt. It is probably from the mid-2nd century, roughly 150, something like that. It is Gnostic, clearly Gnostic. Why is that different than the Gospel of John?
Saw is more true to what happened.
And why would we think that?
I don't know, I just said it.
You said it because it sounded good, huh? Right? Well, it's because there is this body of witnesses who were with Jesus. When these things began to be written down, there are guarantors of their authenticity who were there. That is not true of something like the Gospel of Judas. This is written many, many decades after all of them were dead. But the Gospel of John is within the living witness of those who knew Jesus. And I think this is a really important idea, because it's an idea that's going to come up again and again in modern times, especially from those who want to press for the Gnostic Gospels. there is this huge difference between the Gospel of John and these other kinds of Gospels. And that difference has to do with his body of witnesses. John claims to be an eyewitness of what he saw. The Gnostic Gospels written later don't have that advantage. Now, this is sort of the way Gospels were written. You start with the living voices of the apostles and the other witnesses. In the very earliest period, no one is writing anything down. First of all, Jesus never told anybody to write Gospels. He didn't say, go into all the world, preach the gospel to every preacher, and oh, by the way, write all this stuff down. He doesn't say that. So in the very earliest period of the church, going back to our discussion in 2 Peter, when many early Christians thought Jesus might come back in their own lifetime, there wasn't really a need to write down the story of Jesus, because the world wasn't going to last that much longer anyway. But as soon as these living witnesses begin to die, this oral stage begins to give way to some written things. You find some of them referenced briefly in the beginning of Luke. Do you remember how Luke's gospel begins? Many others have taken it into hand to write about these things that are so precious to us. And since I understood it from the beginning, I also did. Luke seems to suggest that at that early period, there were already some people who were writing down the story of Jesus. He doesn't seem to be talking about Matthew necessarily, although maybe he includes that. But at least the fact that he says many suggests that this is a group of some sort, of a larger body than just one or two. Then you have the beginning of Paul's letters. Paul sometimes says things about Jesus that is earlier than the writing of the Gospels, because Paul is writing earlier than the writing of the Gospels. For instance, Paul tells us what Jesus said on the night he was betrayed. How he took bread, he gave thanks. This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. That's Paul, but he's speaking out of the oral tradition of the church. Sometimes, on rare occasions, Paul may say something that Jesus said that the Gospels don't even tell us about. Have you ever heard the saying of Jesus, it is more blessed to give than it is to receive? They always use that in an offering time, you know. Paul says the Lord said that. But if you look in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you won't find any place where he did say that. The only place you find he said that is in Paul. So that's part of this oral tradition of the church that Paul knows about, but eventually nobody actually wrote it down, except Paul himself. Then we have the Gospel of Mark, which is written out of the memories of Peter, shortly after Peter's death. And then Matthew and Luke, which are written a little bit later, and then the Gospel of John. But all within the living memory of a body of people who had known Jesus personally. Now, John's Gospel is unique in these four portraits of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I kind of like to use the word portrait. Have you ever seen more than one portrait of a person, and they each say something about him? There was an exhibit about maybe 5 years ago. It was in the Louvre in Paris. It was in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It was in the Detroit Institute of Arts, of 6 portraits of Jesus by Rembrandt. And this was the first time these 6 portraits had been together since Rembrandt himself owned them, because he went bankrupt late in his life and he sold off all his stuff and to stay out of prison. And these portraits got scattered around the world. And so they brought I guess there were 6 of them, these 6 portraits together of Jesus. All of them are different, but they're all using the same model. And Rembrandt, incidentally, was the first European artist to use Jewish models. He's unique in that regard. All the earlier painters used just Europeans for models of Jesus, but Rembrandt lived in the Jewish quarter in Amsterdam. And so he actually used Jewish models. And these 6 portraits are all using the same model. So the same person is being painted, but 6 different times. And you can see it's the same person. But each of them are different from the other one because the pose is slightly different. The turn of the head is slightly different. One of them is looking up, one is looking down, one is looking sideways. In a way, this is a little bit like the Gospels. The Gospels are portraits of Jesus. Each Gospel paints, if I can use that metaphor, paints the picture of Jesus in a way that is unique to him. I don't think that makes them in conflict with each other. Even with Rembrandt's 6 portraits, they're all the same model. There's not some one that say, okay, this one is right, but this one's wrong. They're all right, but they're different. And John's portrait of Jesus is going to be unique in that regard. For one thing, the narratives about Jesus' ministry have a lot of internal differences, and generally the events that John talks about are not talked about in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's a few that are, but mostly what John gives us are things that you won't find anywhere else except in the Gospel of John. Furthermore, almost everything that John tells us about Jesus happens in Jerusalem, whereas most everything that Matthew, Mark, and Luke tells us about Jesus happened in Galilee. Now, there's some things in the other Gospels that happen in Jerusalem, and in John's Gospel there are some things that happen in Galilee, but mostly what John tells us about Jesus happens in Jerusalem. And mostly what Matthew, Mark, and Luke tells us about Jesus happened farther north, up in the province of Galilee. Furthermore, if you only read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you might suspect that the ministry of Jesus was only about a year long. But in John's Gospel, we know it was longer than that because John talks about 3 Passovers. And Passovers only happen once a year, right? So if you have 3 of them in John's Gospel, that means the ministry of Jesus had to be not less than a little over 2 years long, maybe as long as 3 years, or maybe as long as 3.5 years. But 3 Passovers makes it a longer span of time that we know from John's Gospel that we wouldn't know if we were only reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, I don't think, as I mentioned, that those differences imply contradiction, but they do suggest that in the 4th Gospel, the writer is following his own pattern, his own course, in which he's going to talk about the Messiahship of Jesus. Here's some other differences between them. The Synoptics have many references to the kingdom of God, dozens of them. The 4th Gospel only has 2, right together. The Synoptics have many parables. The 4th Gospel doesn't have a single one. No parables in John. Jesus teaches in long discourses, but he doesn't teach through these stories like a certain man went out to plant seed in his field and that sort of thing. Although there are a lot of exorcisms in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are no exorcisms in John. He just doesn't have any. That's not to say that Jesus didn't do them. He doesn't say he didn't, but he just doesn't comment on that. In the Synoptics, Jesus cleanses the temple shortly before his death in his last trip to Jerusalem. But in John's Gospel, this event occurs early in Jesus' ministry. Now, this is a more significant issue. We're going to talk about this earlier, or not early, but later, why this early description is here, but it at least should raise the question. Does John put this earlier for thematic reasons? Or maybe Jesus cleansed the temple twice. Maybe he cleansed it at the beginning of his ministry and at the end of his ministry. But in either case, it is a difference between John and the others. Here is a really big one. In the Synoptics, the death of Jesus occurs on the Passover. But in the 4th Gospel, it occurs on the day before the Passover. And why is that? We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Maybe a calendar difference. That difference still has an effect that reaches all the way to the 21st century. These 2 calendar issues. Because the Eastern Church, the Orthodox community, uses leavened bread for communion. because it was the day before Passover and they're following John's chronology. The Western Church follows the synoptic chronology and generally uses unleavened bread because it was the first day of Passover, the first day of unleavened bread. So even today, in the same city, you're going to have, a Lutheran church over here, Greek Orthodox church over here, and they have a difference about the bread that goes back to this calendar issue. It's amazing how sometimes things spin out over the centuries. Now, the early church fathers explained these differences by saying that the fourth gospel is a supplement to the synoptics. This is a quotation from Eusebius. They, early Christians, say that the beloved disciple provided what was lacking in the synoptics of the deeds done by Christ at the beginning of his ministry. They say, therefore, that the Apostle John, being asked to do it for this reason, gave in his gospel an account of the period which had been omitted by the earlier evangelists. So at least one of the testimonies of the early church is that John's gospel intentionally supplies information that is additional about the life of Jesus that was not in the synoptic gospels. Maybe it doesn't cover all the differences, but at least in the broad sense, I think it is certainly true. So, back to my questions. Do you think? You should say, yes, I think. Every now and again I do. Once in a while. Do you think Christians should pay special attention to the differences between John and the other Gospels? What are the risks? What are the advantages? Should we worry about these differences?
It adds to our understanding of who Jesus was. It adds to our understanding. Okay,
it adds to our understanding. Certainly, those differences in which it gives information that's not available elsewhere. So it fills out the picture. And that really relates to something John said at the end of his gospel. When you read it this afternoon, if that's what you're going to do, you're going to find it says that Jesus did many other things besides the ones I'm talking about. And in fact, if we wrote them all down, the whole books of the whole world wouldn't be big enough to contain them all. But we have written these things down. So John is selective, but for the most part, he selects things that are not found elsewhere. So it fills out our picture of Jesus. That would be certainly true. That's the safest answer. Anybody else? What's the risk of emphasizing differences? Yeah.
It might distract a person from the true meaning of why the book is written.
Well, yeah, they might become preoccupied with differences like this, and they could end up thinking these differences are contradictions in some way, and that undermines their ability to affirm the trustworthiness of the record, certainly. Pardon me?
It causes disunity.
It certainly can cause disunity. If you go to a Lutheran church and you bring in leavened bread, that will create some disturbance because they don't use leavened bread. They use unleavened bread, and that would be true of the Anglican Church, and most Protestant churches use unleavened bread, as well as the Catholic Church. Yeah.
I think we do it to serve the world because some of the world is looking. Some of the people out there are looking at these issues, and it's keeping them from faith in Christ. So we do it. Maybe even if I'm not don't even lean that way, I should dig in as much as I can because it might help that guy.
Because you might have an answer for somebody that needs an answer.
The stakes are big. Yeah.
Sometimes the first step in evangelism may not always be the gospel, but maybe removing some blocks that people have before they can actually hear the gospel. What some people have called pre-evangelism. Removing difficulties so that you can hear the story. So that could be the truth, yeah. Given the four Gospels, what is the advantage in having multiple witnesses? Yeah.
It's just like witnesses in a court. You have the different accounts and different views
Sure.
of what's happening.
Sure.
Everyone's going to be subjective.
Everybody offers a perspective that's important, even though they may be different than the next person, but they were there, they saw it. And there was an attempt in the early church to reduce the four Gospels to one Gospel. There was a work called the Diatessaron by an early church leader by the name of Tatian, and he took Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and kind of stitched them all together into one really long Gospel. But in the end, the church did not buy it. They stuck with the four Gospels. Even though Tatian's Diatessaron, we still have a copy of it. We know what it looks like and what he did. But that doesn't become the dominant witness of Jesus. It is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I think the early church was wise not to do away with the four Gospels and just have one. Because they offer these perspectives on the life of Jesus that are unique to themselves. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah.
I think it's more important to focus rather on the similarities rather than the differences when you have four Gospels, because that really speaks to the authenticity, because you have four different people at four different times writing about the same person and offering different angles, but at the core of it, the message is the same.
Yeah. Okay, I think you're right. I certainly buy that. Yeah. Well, we kind of talked about that. Let's talk a little bit about structure. John's Gospel has some particular structural elements that are important to recognize, and that's not true of all Bible books. I know in the SBSs they do a structural analysis of each of the books. And some of those lend themselves more easily to structural analysis than others. But John is one of those who does lend himself to that. And it divides naturally into four sections. There is a prologue, this opening description of the incarnation. Then there is, in that, maybe I should stick with this a minute. In this opening hymn of incarnation, this opening of John's Gospel is very different than Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke give us birth stories. They tell us about the angel that talked to Mary and about Joseph's flight to Egypt and all of that sort of thing, the coming of the Melchior, Balthazar, and so on. No, they didn't call them that. They just call them the wise men. Later tradition names these guys, but we don't really know their names. I shouldn't have said that. That just muddies the water. But they do talk about the birth stories of Jesus. John doesn't talk about the birth stories of Jesus, but he does talk about Jesus' origins in the very bosom of the Father. He was in the bosom of the Father. No one has ever seen God, but God, the only Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, who is at the Father's side, he is made him known. He goes all the way back to Jesus' heavenly origins. And the prologue anticipates a lot of things that are going to come up later in the Gospel. As you begin reading this afternoon in this early chapter of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. When you read that, you're going to run into words like word, light, darkness, life, grace, truth, testimony, law, belief. All of these ideas that are going to come up again and again and again throughout the Gospel. He sort of gives you a preview of the really big ideas that are important about Jesus in this opening of the Gospel. The second part of the Gospel of John is what sometimes scholars call the Book of Signs. The term Book of Signs is not a biblical phrase, it is a scholarly phrase, but it describes a section of the Gospel of John in which everything centers around 7 signs that Jesus did, and associated with those signs are lengthy sermons or discourses about the meaning of those signs. So, while in the synoptics Jesus performs many miracles, sometimes you can get 7 miracles in the Gospels in about a chapter. But in John's Gospel, he's only got 7. But these 7 are very carefully chosen. The first two of them are numbered. This is the first sign. This is the second sign, which gives you the sort of trajectory that you should count the signs, and you're going to end up to a 7. By the way, is the number 7, you think that's significant for John? Yeah. I would say probably the number 7 is one of those real important numbers. And so I don't think this is accidental. The fact that they are called signs is important. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, probably tomorrow. But the nature of a sign is to point beyond itself. That's a little bit different than just a miracle. Because a miracle focuses upon the event itself. A sign points beyond the event to what the sign means. And John's gospel is very much about what the signs mean. They're not just wonders to make people say, oh, wow, oh, cool, very cool. They are something that says something about the identity of Jesus and his work that are demonstrated through the sign. And so these lengthy discourses often reflect upon this meaning. Here are the 7 signs. The water turned to grape juice if you're Baptist, and wine if you're Reformed, I guess. I don't know. I hope if you're Baptist you weren't taking offense at me when I said that. Or Reformed either, for that matter. Anyway, that's the first miracle. Then there is the healing of the official son, which Jesus sends his word and heals this boy at a distance. Then there's the healing of the invalid at Bethesda, in which Jesus asked him the very important question, do you want to get well? You know, not everybody does. Some people enjoy their sicknesses. They get to talk about it a lot. They get to share their sicknesses with everyone else. When you ask them how they are, you kind of wish you hadn't asked because they spend a long time telling you, that sort of thing. So anyway, there's a third one. Then the feeding of 5,000, that is the fourth one. Then there is the walking on the Sea of Galilee to the disciples. That's sort of a private miracle. Wasn't done publicly. And then there's the healing of the man born blind. And finally, there is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Now, as you look at these 7 signs in John's Gospel, I think if you look at them, you can see how the magnitude of the sign keeps getting bigger and bigger. You start with water into wine. Well, that's pretty amazing. But then you have Jesus healing somebody when he's not even there. He sends his word and heals him. And then you have this man who has been a cripple for all of these years, and Jesus says, pick up your bed and go home. And then Jesus does a creation miracle in which he takes a few small loaves and a couple of fish and he feeds thousands of people. This is a miracle of creation. And then walking on the Sea of Galilee. How impressive was that to the disciples? They said, who is this man? Who is this man? The healing of the man born blind. No one had ever even heard of someone healing a man born blind. He had never ever seen. And now he sees. And finally, the raising of Lazarus from the dead. You can see he ups the ante, as we say idiomatically. It becomes more, the magnitude gets greater as you move down. And all of these are going to prepare you for the last great miracle of Jesus, which is not one of the 7 signs, but they're all working toward that, and that is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. They're building toward that 8th big issue, the resurrection of Jesus. Then, the third section of the Gospel of John is what is sometimes called the Book of Glory. Here the word glory starts taking on special meaning as it refers to the lifting up of Jesus on the cross and his resurrection from the dead. This is when John's Gospel says Jesus is glorified. Now, there is an irony to this because we don't normally think of execution as being a moment of glory. When somebody goes to the electric chair, we don't usually say, oh, he was glorified. We might say he was electrified, but not glorified. But in the language of Jesus, the lifting up on the cross and the resurrection is when he reaches the pinnacle of his glory. So, consistently he speaks of his passion and death as his glorification. Notice that language when you read it this afternoon. In the Book of Signs section, Jesus repeatedly talks about the hour of his glorification, but it's not come yet. But now, when we get to the book of glory, Jesus says, the hour has come. This is the hour. This is the time of my glorification. His glory is first associated with signs, but in his death, that glory is intensified by the greatest sign of all, which is his death and his resurrection from the dead. And so in that section, Jesus is going to teach his disciples to prepare them for his return to the Father. And he will be with them no longer. And then finally, you have the epilogue, which is the fourth section of the gospel. It closes with Jesus' resurrection appearance to 7 disciples in Galilee. One of those 7 was the writer of the fourth gospel, the beloved disciple. And so it carefully prepares you for this author, but withholds his identity until the very end. So I won't say too much more about that. We'll talk about that later. So this is one place where I would suggest that the structure of the fourth gospel is probably pretty important to pay attention to. If we were doing the book of Jeremiah, I would say, quite frankly, there is no structure. But in the Gospel of John, this is important. The prologue of incarnation, the book of signs, the book of glory, and the epilogue. So I'm answering my own question, but do you think the structure, yeah, somebody says, do you think the structure is important? No, I don't think so. What do you make of the fact that John only has 7 miracles?
What are the 3 he left out?
Pardon me?
What are the 3 he left out?
3? He leaves out more than 3. He leaves out dozens. All kinds of miracles in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that he doesn't talk about. The healing of the 10 lepers, the raising from sickness of Peter's mother-in-law. I mean, you could go on and on. All the exorcisms, the demoniac at Gadara. I mean, he doesn't talk about any of those things. So he just confines himself to 7. Why do you think he does that? And what is he doing with that?
He had a clear agenda.
I think that's really important. He had a clear agenda. He's going somewhere with these 7. He doesn't just randomly pick 7. He is taking 7 that are going to lead you through a path of understanding the meaning of Jesus the Messiah. He could have talked about all the others, and those are important and they're real and they happened. But these 7 have special inner meaning because they're linked with his teaching about who he was. It's only when you understand Jesus as the bread from heaven that you understand what the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 is really about. It's not just about more bread. It's about man does not live by bread alone. It's about who Jesus was as the bread from heaven. When you come to the story of the man born blind, it's not just about a man born blind, it's about light and darkness, understanding as opposed to lack of understanding. Okay? When you come to the raising of Lazarus, it's not just a benefit for one man, it's a prelude to what's going to happen to Jesus himself, who's going to die and be placed in a tomb like Lazarus was. But unlike Lazarus, who was raised by Jesus, Jesus is resurrected with no other person around. So I think these 7 miracles in John are really quite important as they lead us through the meaning of Jesus' Messiahship. All right, we were going to aim for, what, about 12? And it's about 4 minutes after 12. This is a good place to bid you all good day and hope you have a nice afternoon and I will see you in the morning. God bless you all.